Okay, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan. That was a lot of material. So now, being bioenergetic folks, we can breathe and get ready to hear another informative and powerful presentation. So Scott Baum, as you all know, is our next presenter. He's a senior faculty in the New York Society for Bioenergetic Analysis and a member of the international faculty in IIBA. He's a coordinating faculty for the Israeli Society of Bioenergetic Analysis and faculty for the IIBA affiliated program in China. Dr. Baum is past president of IIBA and is a current board member. He was the director of psychology training at Roosevelt Hospital and director of psychological services at the Metropolitan Hospital, both in New York City. He maintains a private practice in New York in individual, couple, family, and group psychotherapy, and is known for his sensitive work with people who are seeking release from chronic relational trauma and people struggling with their darkness. Dr. Baum will talk about chronic relational trauma and what can help a therapist walk with clients who live in these dark places. Scott.
Can I move this? Don't touch other people's technology without asking. I need a second to adjust to the shock of encountering you all. Otherwise, I'll go into automatic, and that will defeat the purpose of my presentation today. I'm going to make myself comfortable if I can. Alan and I carried on a correspondence in preparation for this presentation, this shared presentation. And I think you can see and feel his openness and warmth and receptivity. And I read some papers he recommended to me, and as he told you, he read some that I sent him. And each of us derived something from that process. And now listening to him, I realized that I could frame what I wanted to do here today in an even more specific way. What I want to offer you is the other side of this process that he was describing. I want to talk to you from the universe of people who live with borderline and schizophrenic realities. I want to offer you some insight into that and also some support in your work when you work with people like me, like us, like them. And I want to, along the lines of what was talked about yesterday, give you an opportunity to encounter some of your prejudices and attitudes that interfere with your work with people like us. I have to take off my shoes. So the material that I'm using here comes from two sources. Primarily, it comes from me and a very long process of psychotherapy with many, that's not correct, with a few. very devoted and dedicated psychotherapists. I added in many because I have encountered many people in my life who've acted psychotherapeutically. So the empirical data for this study, the evidence, if you will, is the hard-won evidence of my own experience. Finally, I have reached the point in my life where that evidence is not disputable. I've looked around a little bit for the phrase chronic relational trauma, and it seems like it must have been around forever. But in fact, at least unless you can present me with a citation, I'll be interested. The first appearance of it was in an article published by my late wife, Elaine Tusillo, posthumously in the Journal of the IIBA. So first, some definitions. Chronic means that the event happens continuously. That is, it's an over and over again event, but in fact, psychologically and emotionally, it's continuous. It never abates. I have to be very clear about that. It never stops. That's what chronic means. And relational means that the processes involved in this over and over again event are not solely psychic within the individual. They are not driven by physiological processes. They are intrinsic to interactions between people. That's where the trauma is taking place. And trauma means that the events and the emotional and psychological impact of the events are overwhelming to the person. That is, not overwhelming momentarily, because we all live with that on a daily basis, but they are sufficiently overwhelming to the person that the person is unable to fully experience and then digest and then metabolize the experience so as to turn it into useful ego function subsequently. So people may survive and even cope with the events, and there's a lot made in today's theory and discussion about resiliency. Well, if it isn't already plain to you, if those of you who know me quite well know this, it ought to be plain after this presentation. I am enormously resilient. Survival is not that big a success. So the person may survive and even cope with this chronically traumatizing process, but without the ability to digest the events and make use of them in a constructive way, the residual effect remains continuously. Chronic relational trauma occurs at all developmental levels. That's quite clear to me. I'm going to present you with a reality that is created by the most dire of circumstances. Learning from the most dire circumstances is a traditional way to uncover the deep dynamics and, in our case, energetic forces that are present when there is a process of chronic relational trauma. So we look at the worst of things in order to understand the more subtle manifestations of the process. I'll say again, it's my own experience that provides me the guide to present this. So I am reporting to you from a different universe. I won't say a different universe from all of you, but I will say that it's a different universe from most of you. And it's critical, in my view, to understand that the physics of that universe, the emotional and psychic and interpersonal physics are themselves intrinsically different than the physics in a universe that begins with a self. Most therapists do not live in this universe that I am talking to you about. That's a fact, as far as I can tell, anyway. And one of the difficulties in teaching about and supervising about and sharing this with people who don't live in the universe, along the lines of what Christina was saying yesterday about how difficult it is to apprehend in the philosophical sense, know deeply through one's body the reality of another, is that if that reality occupies a universe with a different set of physics, without an experiential base in it, you are going to have to understand it by entering it from the outside in. Well, we bioenergetic therapists have a particular skill for doing just that. And I think that to understand or apprehend or at least deepen your knowledge through my presentation, it would benefit from the kind of experiential skill that we have. So I'm going to offer you a direct experience of this universe. We use this in our teaching model. Those of you who are in our community, you know this. And I'm going to invite you into a brief induction, maybe 5 minutes total. And I want you to exercise care. This is an intense experience. It will take you into this universe if it's successful. And if that feels anxiety-provoking or threatening, then please don't do it. If it's too much to stay in the room, if you feel it will take you, even though you don't want to be taken, by all means, step out of the room for 5 minutes. If you don't enter the induction, but you want to stay in the room and you want to observe what happens, by all means do that and pay attention to what happens to you and what would happen to you as a therapist, as someone would go in and out of these altered states of consciousness. So if you're available for it, put your feet flat on the floor, sit yourself upright in your chair and close your eyes. And as you breathe, release yourself, the weight of you, into the chair, and start to feel yourself sink through the chair and through the floor, so that with each exhalation, you take yourself deeper and deeper through the floor. You start to feel yourself sinking, first the lower half of your body, and then up through your torso, shoulders and chest, and eventually head, face, neck, top of the head. All of you has now sunk through the floor, and you find yourself in an empty, dark space. There is nothing here. It is completely empty. There is not even air. You don't know how you're breathing. The first of the impossible things we will encounter in this presentation. But somehow you are. But you don't know how. You can feel your lungs begin to densify and adhesions develop so that you are no longer consciously breathing. The space is entirely empty. There is a coldness in it. And the coldness is the coldness of absolute zero. That is a coldness where no warmth exists, molecules are not moving. There's a black hole in the middle of your back, out of which all the energy in your body drains to go somewhere you do not recognize where. There is nothing there. There is no connection to benevolence, to goodness in this space. You are fully suspended in a completely empty, cold, hard space, and in that space, entities, things, creatures begin to come at you, and you start to feel the terror of uncontrollable attack, assault from all sides, coming and going, entering your body and leaving your body, taking possession of you, leaving you, and you feel the terror, you feel your own paralysis, your own incapacity to understand what's happening. Anytime you try to build a moment of positive self-regard, of positive acknowledgement of yourself, it is instantaneously dissolved, torn down, like a sandcastle being wiped out by the crashing wave. Nothing can build. And here you are. Now I'm going to stay silent for 1 minute. I will not leave you in this space, and I will resume talking in 1 minute. But I want to give you 1 minute in here totally by yourself. And when you come back out of it, see if you can bring back with you some of the sensations that arise in this space so that you can carry them with you through the rest of my presentation. So I'm going to stop talking now for 1 minute, but at the end of that minute, I will bring you back out of this state. Feel yourself now begin to come back up through the floor, rising up. Notice that as you come through the floor, your breath opens, the adhesions in your lungs begin to release, your lungs inflate and deflate. The air, the sound, the warmth, everything becomes different, and you're back in this reality. So take a moment. When you're ready, open your eyes and come back into this space. In my experience, over many, many years of investigating this reality in me, these sensations that arise in this space cannot be rendered in words. As most of you have discovered, I'm fairly good with words. And I frequently encounter moments in my sessions, my own and with my patients, where the sensations do not have language to attach to them. It is not a question of pre-verbal experience being now rendered in language. These are sensations for which I have found no applicable language. So let's look a little bit at the underlying structure here. It is impossible in this universe that I offered you a moment in to build any sense of positive self-regard. Let's remember that narcissism is a healthy and necessary component of self-development. It has to do with the creation, the establishment, and the maintenance of self-esteem. Self-esteem is positive regard for oneself, not love. Love is a different energy. We are bioenergetic therapists. In my view, someday we'll discover that there are quantum energies attached to each of these emotional states, and you can no more substitute love for respect than you can substitute vitamin C for vitamin D. They have different effects on the body. Love expands the whole body system. Respect lifts up under the diaphragm and creates an expansive opening of shoulder and lifting into head, and a bearing that we call proud, because it has to do with a feeling of goodness. Power and goodness are related to each other. I'll say more about that in a moment. So in this universe, the problem is not of low self-esteem. As Kernberg said many years ago in a grand rounds that I attended, which was tremendously helpful to me, the problem he was talking about borderline people, the problem in borderline people is not a problem of low self-esteem, it's a problem of no self-esteem. The structures for self-esteem, for positive self-regard, have been destroyed. I'll give you a concrete example. I like concrete examples. I think they help to make what I'm talking about and what we're talking about more tangible. Yesterday, Pi came up to me at the emeritus interview, lovely interview with Bob, conducted by Virginia. And she said to me, "Conference is going very well. You must have some good feeling about it." And Pi is very dear to me, and I know what she's intending. And I'm forced to respond on two completely different levels. From the middle layer of my body, somewhere between the most surface layer and the viscera, there's a recognition of the reality that things are going well, and there's a kind of gratification. At the center of my body, in the core, it is untouched by that reality of goodness and that things are going well. And so I give her one of these da-da-da-da reactions, and the usual therapist reaction to that, and now I'm not talking about Pi anymore, is to say something like, well, if you would allow yourself to feel the goodness. Now, if we're going to talk about re-traumatization and the therapy of borderline and schizophrenic people, that's re-traumatizing. Telling me that I can feel something I cannot feel, and the only reason I don't feel it is because I don't want to, that's a re-traumatization. And I'll get to that a little more in a moment, because that is taken up far too much of our therapeutic work in people with very early developmental disturbance. The destruction of the capacity for positive self-regard rests on the creation of a state in the child, an ongoing state, which we call technically anhedonia. Anhedonia is a Greek word meaning without the capacity for pleasure. It does not mean can't enjoy himself. Pleasure here, I believe, is defined as a connection to benevolence and goodness, not as discharge, not as gratification, not as relief, not as satisfaction, not as fulfillment. These are all important functions. but they are not for me what we mean by pleasure. Why use the same word for everything if we can actually define differences? In my view, a deep reading of Reich and Lowen leads us to this understanding of pleasure. And so it's different from these other functions. It's not that they are not important functions, but it's different. In borderline and schizophrenic people, the connection to benevolence in the universe has been severed. There are no body receptors for goodness. So benevolence cannot be experienced, although it can be observed. I wrote in one of my articles about my experience with my wife and children of standing and watching them surrounded in this golden field of a loving warmth for each other, not without problems, I assure you. And I felt myself like the alien visitor. You know, there's a famous article about what would happen if an alien came and visited us and went to an inpatient unit. And I felt myself encased in a spacesuit, completely filled with toxic fumes. As I watched them, I could see the connection and the connectedness between them. I couldn't participate in it. So it's an important question for a bioenergetic therapist, because I'm pretty much a physicist when it comes to things like this. I want to know what caused that. It's not really mystical to me. It's very tangible. I think bioenergetic analysis gives us a set of concepts and a language to experience and understand and study these things in a very direct, material way. Well, I can't go into it here at length, because I've written elsewhere, as much as I know, about how a child's soul is murdered. Here I want to focus on something else. I want to focus on the fact that this murder is an intentional act. Now, before you start to react, if I can catch you before this reaction, note that I said intentional. I did not say conscious. Most people confuse the two. Mostly we believe, I think many of you believe, that human beings are structured and organized and act based on unconscious intention. In fact, I would go far as to say, because I have a number of radical positions these days, that there's very little that human beings do that is not intentional. Very, very little. However, most of it is unconscious. And so it's not consciously thought through and planned and done. It is nevertheless deeply intentional, and intention carries energy, and energy carries the force of emotional and psychic impact. So intention is what affects us. Whether it affects us through conscious action or unconscious action is not the critical matter. The intentions here, and I'll only include a couple of the many, include annihilation. Now, Christina said something yesterday that's really important to me in this respect, which is that annihilation goes beyond making the other person disappear. Annihilation goes to making their very existence on this planet to have ever been here disappear. This is a psychic ripping out of the other person from one's insides. There is a profound Hebrew curse that says, may his name and memory be erased. He should never have existed. This is the force of annihilation. And the other that I want to mention here is the force of possession. That is the internal reality of the child is torn out. My therapist's way of describing it to me once, which was very helpful and meaningful, was that my psychic heart and guts had been torn out, and then I was decimated after that, made to be a tenth of who I am. And the reason for that is that at that point, the child becomes a source of resources for the authorities through hypnotic intervention, through abusive intervention, through manipulation of consciousness, through seduction, through violation. The child is put into an altered state of consciousness, put in like the fly in a cocoon for the spider to feed on, and inducted into the universe of vampires. Vampires are creatures who cannot sustain their own life force and positive self-regard. They have to continuously feed on others. They have no internal structure to build that into something for themselves. One of the critical elements in Reich's formulations, political formulations, was that when people have a connection to their own organic sexuality, they become self-determining. I think more correctly what I would say is, when the capacity for pleasure, in the sense that I mean it here, connection to goodness, benevolence, is destroyed, the knowledge of goodness becomes impossible. And then there is no internal compass to guide one into right behavior. Trauma, as an idea, has been part of the study of bioenergetic analysis since Reich, and it's very deeply part of Freud's study as well. And for me, the view we have that's derived from these studies moves far too quickly and too completely to what happens inside the individual. For me, to understand these most severe cases of chronic relational trauma, the therapist has to be able to analyze the relationships that have caused the conditions. People in my family, my children and many of their friends, are very engaged in such a deep political analysis, a macro analysis. I am interested in that, a little daunted by them, but particularly interested in the way those same forces operate in the people I am with individually in this very intimate process of psychotherapy and in this intimate process with myself. We are indeed analyzing abuses of power, but power here refers to instrumentality. It refers to that state in the child's body when the child is inspired. I feel good about myself. I feel good about myself. That's accompanied by an uprightness and an ability to support oneself in one's instrumentality, in the power to do things, in the power to influence. We are so phobic of influence, as therapists, many of us, that we pull ourselves back and we don't actually see the influence we have. This is about power, not about authority, not about control, not about domination. It's about power, the power to define what is good, the power to believe in oneself. Or let's take an imaginary child. What the message is to the child in the healthy family is, you are very powerful, and I have faith in you. I have faith in you acts as the support for the diaphragm, for the maintenance of an upright posture. I'm going to say something now that you may not follow too well, and I realize that the reason for that is I've been stewing in this for some years now, and I haven't been able to render it as clearly as I would like. There's a tremendous emphasis in the field of psychotherapy on what has been called secondary gain. That is what the patient derives as some kind of gain for themselves from characterizing themselves as a victim of others. And that begins to take up, in some cases, 90% of the space of the therapy. And 10% is, oh yes, I validate and I bear witness to and I see that you have been victimized, and I'm going to suggest to you that you ought to reverse the proportions. That we very quickly pass over the ways in which people, at least in this universe, have been victimized. And I had a conversation with Danita a while back that was very helpful to me. Because if I say to you, is the chronic relational trauma that a borderline or schizophrenic person experience, is that ongoing today? And if you say to me, well, only if they're in the same situation, well, then you've missed the lesson of character structure. The trauma is ongoing. It's ongoing because it's embedded in the internal reality of the person. I had a vision many years ago of my father and I stuck together from our waist down in a tuber-like material spinning in space. I have spent almost 50 years now screaming and kicking and punching and looking and seeing what it was that trapped me with him that way, because he saved my life when my life was seriously endangered. And I still find, if some of you have read my article, you know this, I still find that I can't fully hold my position in my stomach when I try to see who the man actually was. So I think the main focus of the therapy should be on a cogent, politically driven analysis of what goes on in such victimization, and that the therapist is called on to take a position about such victimization. Political position means it's about power and the deployment of power, and power is about goodness, so therapists should be willing to say, that was bad. That was bad. A much smaller part of the work, not irrelevant, but smaller, is on whatever gain, manipulative gain, unhealthy gain, the patient might derive by clinging to a caricature of their own victimization and victimhood. I think this emphasis leads to a treatment mistake. Not just an individual treatment mistake, I make those every day and have to find my way back from them. I mean a more systematic or systemic mistake. The victim, our patient, is seen as a perpetrator by virtue of committing this interpersonal maneuver of getting some gain by claiming to be a victim and therefore entitled to some special treatment, which, again, I'll say, I want to be clear, should be encountered characterologically by the therapist as a destructive and self-defeating maneuver, ultimately. But the reality of a victim who is, in fact, a perpetrator, who is mind-fucking and attacking those near him or her is actually avoided, as is the analysis of the relationship in which that took place being avoided. If you're going to say to me that your parents did the best they could under the circumstances that they were living in, I ought to be able to see that for myself. You should not need to convince me of that. I'm fully capable of giving people the benefit of the doubt. Well, why do we make this mistake? Mistake in my view. There's a great emphasis nowadays on the transformative effects of therapeutic intervention, which I believe is all to the good. I believe such transformations can occur. It is necessary to be open to them. As Stephen Johnson said, it's a hard work miracle, and it is indeed a miracle. But the focus on that end of the continuum represents a clinical bias, and it distorts clinical practice. Because the child subjected to chronic relational trauma, the kind that I'm describing here, the universe I live in, can experience a transformation to evil. And to ignore that transformation is to propose an alternative transformation that cannot be accomplished, at least not without an acknowledgement of the original transformation. So that transformative experience must be attended to as rigorously as the transformative good experiences are. And understanding this transformation requires analyzing the dynamics of the chronic processes of trauma, somatopsychically, because they are structured in the whole person at the very beginning or before the very beginning. Bioenergetic analysis teaches us not to be confused by appearances. That is a big lesson. I'll give you an example from my own experience. Many years ago, I was fairly briefly the director of a psychology department at a New York City hospital. And one of my staff was very interested in behavior modification technique that used galvanic skin response, the difference in conductivity on the skin, and he hooked us up to these two little electrodes, and the resistance to the charge was translated into an analog by sound, and you could hear supposedly how tense a person was, and as Alan was saying, the relationship between tension and anxiety is fairly accepted. And so the different members of the staff put the two little electrodes on and turn up the volume, and for most people it sounded anywhere from to right, depending on their state. By then I had been a patient in bioenergetic therapy for a very long time, and so I knew what was going to happen. And when I put the two little electrodes on, what came out of the speaker was I have tremendous interoceptive awareness. I can slow down my breathing. I can release very easily surface muscular tension. But my insides were aflame, endlessly burning. To get to that requires the work of character analysis. It requires the work of softening all the layers of defense, of not being fooled by appearance, of not mistaking the patient's struggle to live through this for the actual underlying reality. This burning comes from a number of sources. The only one I'm going to mention here today is one I haven't seen elsewhere, which is that I've discovered that human beings have a very strong need to find someone to have burn in hell. I always thought it was my discovery, and then I heard in an interview John Lennon say, "My fondest hope," which has been mine, "is that time wounds all heals." For those of you who don't speak English natively, the idea is that eventually all people who do harm will suffer. This is a human invention, and many parents need someone to suffer for what has been done to them, for the hypocrites and the self-righteous and the abusive, and they cannot get at the people who did it to them, and so they get at their children. The interior reality for borderline and schizophrenic people is an impossible reality to live in. Every element of reality is painful. Light, warmth, beauty produce these awful and unbearable sensations. It's essentially a psychotic state, and psychosis has nothing good to say for it. There is nothing good to say for it. It's a terrifying and excruciating state. It waxes and wanes, but it is unbearable. All the things that you may have experienced, terror, the severing of the connection to benevolence, rage, stimulation far too great for a baby's body. So this is the universe that the therapist enters. I led a pre-conference workshop on this theme at the last IIBA conference. People stayed in that state much longer. And Vera Fauser came up to me at the end of the day and she said, "That was very helpful to me in understanding at least one of my patients much more, but I don't know how a person can live in that." For me, breathing, kicking, screaming, gagging were ways every single day, this is only not true in the very recent past, to enter the living reality of the moment. So these were immensely useful ways for me to go from small streams of barely felt sensation, from living death to an aliveness of the moment in reality, but that had to be done for me every day, multiple times a day, every time I needed to come into reality. So there are not wholly organized feelings there waiting to be felt. There are sensations that might be built into feeling one day. The therapist who enters hell enters the space where the sign over the door says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And so it's the therapist who holds the hope in his or her body in the face of the impossibility of hope for the person who inhabits the space. As I wrote in the piece that I sent out to you, it may not be enough that a therapist abides in this universe with a person living there. It may be necessary to be found. I was found and held on to. To a great extent, I protected my therapists and my therapies by living out my negative transference with Elaine. In part because I unconsciously knew the strength and safety of her connection to me. Those of you in this room who knew her knew that she was no pushover. So I have a deep and abiding regret for failing her by persisting in acting out my malevolence with her. At the same time, I have come to accept that she got to live the life she wanted to live with someone who would stretch to live as close to that life as I could get. I often feel like I am living up against a membrane, or I'm like the person in the ocean who's floating and only his face is above the surface, and at any moment I will be yanked back into this universe or overcome by a wave. Years ago, I was invited, very graciously invited, to give a talk at the 30th anniversary of SIAB, one of our great Italian societies. And I wanted to talk on this subject, and I was bewildered by my urge to talk about it. And I finally said to Elaine, why am I doing this? Why am I talking about this? And she said, you have to tell therapists about this so that they know not only more about what they're doing, but that they are doing God's work and that they need support in doing God's work. To work where there is no hope. Elaine's decision, made over and over, to find me and to hold on to me was like being struck by lightning. I'm surely not sure I could have gotten as far as I have despite really good therapists, without that, without being found. And now I am struck by lightning again and survive, and so my struggle continues. I hope that this supports you in your work with people like me. Thank you for allowing me to share my story with you. Thank you. And now, please go back into your small groups.